Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's main London debate, our big event. This evening we will be debating the motion, "This House has lost confidence in austerity." It marks the first event of our development campaign, which is going to be a 4-year project to transform the Union's building facilities within Cambridge at Bridge Street and our charitable activities around the world. You've already seen an example of one of our student debates this evening, which I hope you very much enjoyed, but tonight we now turn to our main debate. Tonight's debate does what the Union is famous for. It brings together a unique panel of speakers to debate a pressing issue of our time. If you're watching online, do tweet us at Cambridge Union with your comments, your questions, or even any complaints, which we can read out, but do please be polite. Tonight, the debate is in our classic Union format, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with by now. So speakers will stand and they'll deliver their speeches. We will alternate between proposition and opposition benches. And if you want to get involved yourselves, anyone is free to stand up and interrupt our speakers during their speeches, and indeed we do encourage you to do so. This is outside of their first and their last minute, please. That is their protected time. You can do this by standing up and saying on that point, or point of information, or even may I cut in. Something similarly British will do. But it's up to the speaker as to whether they do accept you and take your point. And please do keep it brief if you can. There will also be a round of 1-minute fourth speeches in proposition and opposition between each pair of speakers. And that is also your chance to have your say if you don't get to have your point during a speech. And then we'll be able to move through the debate at the end, when you will have a chance to have your vote on tonight's motion. So, this brings us to tonight's main debate, and I will call the first speaker on the proposition, which I believe is our Right Honourable Sir Vince Cable, who was President of Easter 1965. Sir Vince is a former Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills, and the former Member of Parliament for Twickenham. He has a key figure during the coalition negotiations following the 2010 election result, and he was a key member of that government, known for his serious reservations about austerity. He's an alumnus of Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge. Sir Vince.
Well, President, ladies and gentlemen, can I thank you for inviting me? It is an honour. I think the Union is a great bastion of free debate, and I'm personally indebted for introducing me to political debate. The last time I moved a no-confidence debate was over 50 years ago in the Cambridge Union, and it was no confidence in the then Conservative government. And I wish we were doing the same tonight. About just over a year ago, I lost my seat against people who were campaigning on the slogan, "Cameron or Chaos." And, well, you know what's happened. We've got no Cameron, and we've got the total chaos of post-Brexit. But the motion we've got here is a different one, about austerity. I have mixed feelings about taking it on, because austerity isn't a binary yes, no, like, dislike issue. I mean, you can have a bit more or a bit less government spending, you can have a bit more or a bit less deficit and debt. And couching this in very polarised terms, it's a little bit like having somebody in an extremely cold, unpleasant shower, and one group of people are saying, well, nothing you can do about it, just got to put up with it, and anyway, it's good for your soul. And on the other hand, people saying, this is outrageous, I'm freezing to death, I've got to pull down the shower and destroy it. But actually, the sensible thing to do is to adjust the temperature control. And I like to think that when we were in government, that's what we did. We started off in 2010 with quite an aggressive deficit reduction programme in the wake of the deficits of the crisis era. 4 years, but when the economy slowed down, we did what Keynes would have advised. We let the deficit grow, and at the end of our 5-year period, we basically had adopted the same time horizon as the outgoing Labour government. It was flexible. We adjusted to circumstances. So what is this debate about, and why is austerity now a problem? I think we have to go back to the source of the crisis, the crisis of financial capitalism back in 2008, 2009. If I can change my metaphors, it was the economic equivalent of a heart attack. It wasn't just a cyclical thing. It was massive. And it could have caused massive destruction. And it did cause a lot of harm and a lot of pain. And people, even in this country, many people are still poorer than they were before 2008. But we were saved by intervention by governments and central banks who adopted a life support system. And we had temporarily very big government deficits, absolutely the right thing to do. But more important, we had a massive injection of money into the system, quantitative easing, ultra-cheap money, very low interest rates. But we're now 8 years on, and we're still attached to the life support system. That's the problem. And it is now causing serious harm and serious damage, because the effects of the adrenaline that's been pumped in through cheap, ultra-cheap money has been to push up the prices of assets, particularly house prices, causing enormous maldistribution of wealth, causing enormous hardship to younger people trying to get into the housing market. It's ruining pension funds because they can't get a yield on their assets. And increasingly, it's not working, because the underlying objective is to try to get businesses investing by making the cost of capital very cheap. And they're not. And they're not because of extreme uncertainty, which, of course, has now been made many times worse by the Brexit decision. So what do we do? If we're going to prevent us getting back into a very, very deep and painful crash, the government is going to have to step in, and the government is going to have to invest. If private investors won't invest, the government will have to do it. And there's no reason why they shouldn't do it. The cost of borrowing is virtually zero. There are vast numbers of things that government can do. Railways, housing, broadband infrastructure, they're waiting to be dealt with. British infrastructure is decaying. There's an enormous demand for investment. It doesn't add to debt because these things generate income to offset the debt. So why on earth don't they get on and doing it? I believe that after a period of remission from the crisis, which is what we've had, we're now heading back into very serious problems. And the Brexit, I'm just rounding up actually, and the Brexit problem is going to make it a great deal worse. And in these circumstances, we're going to have to regard government as a core part of the solution, not part of the problem, and to invest heavily. And that is why austerity has reached its limits, and we're going to have to adopt a fundamentally different approach to economic policy. Thank you. I move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Vince, for that wonderful opening speech. So I now turn to the opposition, and our first speaker tonight is Ms. Katherine Dunbar, who is our President-elect. Katherine is the President-elect of the Cambridge Union and is currently studying English literature at Magdalen College. She has twice represented Cambridge at the European Universities Debating Championships and has been a finalist at the Oxford InterVarsity.
So firstly, to address the so-called friends involved in organizing this debate, there are better ways to ask me to get my ego in check than to make me open the opposition side, where I'm going to be followed by speakers with far more experience and far more interesting things to say than me. And secondly, hi Mom. So now, moving into my speech, right? So we're going to look at two things. First of all, we're going to talk about debt and the way in which that just can't go on forever. And secondly, we'll talk about the way in which austerity makes us consider tax and makes us consider who pays that tax and who pays the cost for when the government goes under. Two pieces of rebuttal. But before that, austerity isn't glamorous, and it doesn't look anything like the room around you, right? It doesn't look like three-course dinners. It doesn't look like champagne on tap. It looks like tightening your belt so that in the long term, you can get a positive credit rating, so that in the long term, you can allow companies to grow. It's never going to look glamorous, and it's never going to be a quick solution to things. It is always going to require someone somewhere to pay more tax or someone somewhere to lose something. But that is for a long-term gain, right? So moving on, let's talk a little bit about what we heard from Vince, right? So he tells us that austerity is not a binary, right? It's a process whereby sometimes it is the right economic policy, sometimes it isn't. The problem with the wording of this motion is that to lose confidence in austerity means to say that you no longer believe it is a viable policy. The problem with that is that you like ipso facto, you admit that you think it does not work. You think that it is not something we can do, right? You consign it to the dustbin of history, so to speak. And that's a problem, because it is not something that necessarily works 100% all of the time, or something that you can sort of dip in and out of, right? As an ideology, it is something worth having some confidence in, and worth trying at times when it works, right? There are times in which austerity is a useful policy to pursue. Often, these times are when you might not think it is popular. These times are when the economy is doing better, and it actually turns out that those are the times to tighten your belt, because those are the times when you can afford to do those kind of things. Maybe it doesn't work as a fail-safe, as a ripcord, as something that pulls you out of a crisis, but certainly the vast majority of economists agree that it is something that does work in order to maintain the way, like, your government policy. And then secondly, right, so Vince brings us a speech in which he starts by complaining about quantitative easing, and tells us that now, in order to fix that, we need to increase government spending. The problem with that is that the government is often uniquely bad at choosing where to spend or when to spend, right? The reason why we often place so much confidence in private companies and in what they do is because, like, the government has been known to invest in the wrong things. But furthermore, we don't have the kind of projects that Vince leads you to believe we have ready. We don't have shovel-ready projects we can immediately dip into and start making lots of money out of, right? Government spending doesn't always work like that. So moving on then to talk about when austerity has its time and what it looks like to relieve this kind of debt, right? So I think that, it's a sort of basic truth that you cannot keep borrowing forever. You cannot keep claiming that you'll pay things back and keep going and trying to increase government spending to pull yourself out of a hole, right? It is something that often, you have to prove to creditors that there is some kind of plan whereby you can pull yourself out of this debt, whereby, you know when and where spending is an appropriate thing to be doing. The issue with losing confidence in austerity is claiming and having a point of view in which you say that we don't accept that austerity has its time, and we don't accept that there is a place in which we want to be cutting back spending, we want to be increasing taxes. The problem with that is that you then admit that you don't know when to use this policy, and you don't think it's worth using. But secondly, and what's a very interesting thing about implementing austerity as a policy, is that it forces you to increase tax, and that forces you to have a conversation about who pays those taxes, right? It forces you to have a conversation about who is responsible when these kind of things happen, and who is the one who takes the burden for cutting back on government spending. Who are the kind of people who have to readjust in these sort of times, right? And that's an interesting conversation that doesn't happen in a world in which you don't focus on increasing tax, right? It's a conversation in which, take you in a minute actually, it's a conversation that's very difficult to have when you want to increase spending and you don't want to increase tax, because you then don't talk about those people. But first I'll take FA.
While austerity may be a useful policy to have in a
I think that's a very difficult question on the basis that, like, there are issues such as, like, the EU, where it's not just one government's decision on where austerity goes too far, right? So I think, like, in the course of the next 2 minutes I have left of a speech, it'd be very difficult to answer that question. But I think, like, to lose confidence in it is to claim that, like, because there was a time in which some organizations that possibly had more say over state government than a government themselves, sometimes they overspent or sometimes they overreached. The problem then is that if you consign these ideas away because one time they were implemented badly or poorly or by an organization that didn't know best for the countries they were implementing it in, that is problematic because you then create a sort of you create a system whereby you say, we've said it didn't work then, so we're going to lose confidence in it and not use it anymore, which is, it's not effective and that doesn't work, right? The fact that you can point out certain times when it hasn't worked, just as you heard in the debate before, plenty of experts can point out times when it has. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's time to give up entirely because we've, like, made mistakes in the past or poorly implemented it. So finally, just to round out on this idea about tax and about what happens when we cut government spending, I think there's an interesting conversation that happens there among voters and among politicians about what kind of decisions we make when we cut services, what kind of things are essential, and also, more importantly, like where we take this money from. Do we tax the rich? Do we tax in the middle? What are we doing there? And these are conversations that don't happen when you increase spending, because it's very difficult, unless you pursue a policy of austerity, to talk about tax and to talk about who it is that you're taxing. Very proud to speak in this debate. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much for opening up our op so wonderfully. So we now turn to our first round of floor speeches. So if you've been sat there with a burning point but you didn't quite want to butt in, now is your chance. So have I got a speech from the floor in proposition of tonight's motion? At all? Anyway, hand at the back.
Hey, Asia. So my question to the opposition is the narrative around austerity when it started was the financial markets have lost confidence in government as a borrower, and we need to provide austerity, we need to engage in austerity to reduce rates so that people will still lend to us. That's not the case anymore. Interest rates, long-term interest rates, are at ridiculously low levels, and we now have central bankers around the world coming out and saying monetary policy, low-level interest rates cannot stimulate the economy in the way that we think it should. So why are the opposition stood there in opposition to some of the best economists in the world saying that, oh yeah, as long as we keep the 30-year interest rate at 1%, people are going to invest? And actually the people who've got the power to do that literally aren't doing so.
Thank you very much, James. Right, I see a hand there looking very keen, so I'll turn to you there, sir.
I would like to, ladies and gentlemen, adopt the traditional tactic in any Cambridge Union debate, certainly in my day, many years ago, though not quite as long ago as Vince, which is to say, what does one mean by the motion? What is austerity? We actually already seem to have, even in the opening speakers, two different ideas of this, because we have the proposer seeming somehow to say that austerity was something about low interest rates and quantitative easing no longer working, which to me wasn't really austerity. I think austerity to me, but we all have our different ideas of it, is about bearing down on government deficits. And the proposition there is not, yes, the crisis was about the credit rating and so on, but the position now, the long-term position, is how long can this generation go on borrowing money at the expense of a younger generation who will have this debt to service and eventually pay off. So the question is, where you have a deficit still at, I think last time 70, 80 billion pounds sterling in this country I'm talking about, then surely one has to, if austerity means being conscious of that and having it as an important part of public policy, to bear down on that, whatever else one is trying to do by the mix of spending and the mix of tax, then whatever the author who's been discredited, the great discredited Mr. Osborne, because he was discredited, of course, and this is sort of having a go at both sides by his absurd position in the Remain campaign, just because he was discredited over that with his exaggerations, we should not discredit the basic idea of bearing down on that deficit in the long term and in a measured way, which is what, to me, austerity is. And having said that, that is a UK perspective. If I was Greek, I'm sure I'd be in favour of a motion, because clearly austerity imposed by Germans to prop up the euro and the EU, that is a sort of austerity that I would certainly be against. But on a UK basis, and on the basis of austerity meaning about government spending, being responsible and not mortgaging the future for the present, then we must reject this motion.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid in the interest of time, I have to limit the number of floor speeches that I can take, and we now move back to our main debate. Don't worry, we will have another round after our next pair of speakers. But now I turn back to the proposition and Mr. Yanis Varoufakis, who already referenced. Yanis is a Greek economist, an academic, and a former member of the Hellenic Parliament who served as Greek finance minister from January to July 2015 before his resignation. He led negotiations with Troika during the Greek government debt crisis and is also a regular commentator and analyst on news television. Yanis.
First, we indebt ourselves. Then, we indebt the foreigners. And lastly, we indebt our children. Remember that line by David Hume from his treatise on money? He was completely right. And as the former finance minister of a state and of a nation devastated by debt, unsustainable debt, I think I have the capacity to put this position forward. The idea that parsimony is a virtue and profligacy is a sin is one that I am prepared to embrace enthusiastically. The problem with austerity is that it is absolutely unrelated to the notion of parsimony. It is intellectually weak, if not a totally bankrupt idea, macroeconomically dangerous, and morally highly problematic. What is austerity? Let's begin by defining it so that we have the same kind of understanding of what we're talking about. Austerity is the idea that during the bad times, you cut government budget deficits, you create surpluses in order to contain the growth of your debt to GDP ratio. That is what austerity is about. That has never worked in the history of capitalism, and it will never work in the history of capitalism. And the reason why Judge Osborne stopped doing it was because it was not working. And the reason why he was not catastrophic was because he understood that his own policy of austerity was one that deserved to be confined to the dustbin of history where it deserves to be. Allow me to say that there are two basic misconceptions about austerity. The first one is that it is the natural response to an orgy of government spending on the social welfare state. In this country, forget Greece for a moment. Well, just forget Greece. But in this country, there was an orgy of government spending. But it happened in 2008 in support of the City of London and to provide asset insurance for those who already have everything. If you look at the actual result of this spending spree, politically it was essential for a conservative government to press the Lib Dems to accepting a Faustian bargain whereby, after this orgy of spending, there would be cutbacks on those who had nothing to do with the causes of the crisis, on the unsuspecting victims of it. And what was the result? The government reduced the structural deficit of the United Kingdom, spending, let's say, by about 6%. And what happened to debt to GDP? It increased by 19%. And this is not a British exceptionalism kind of scenario. This is what happens everywhere. In every country in Europe where austerity was practiced, the debt to GDP ratio ballooned. It doesn't work. Let me just give you just a simple arithmetic example. It's not rocket science. Take a nation whose debt to GDP ratio is 80%. 80%, which is more or less what it was here. And then imagine that the state budget is about 40% of GDP. Again, more or less the number that pertains to the United Kingdom. Yeah? And imagine that we have an enthusiastic Austerian government that reduces government spending by a half. It goes from 40% of GDP to 20% of GDP. What will happen is, immediately, just because the belt-tightening metaphor is really irrelevant in the case of the state, I believe in belt-tightening. I do try to lose weight and tighten my belt. But the reason why belt-tightening works for a corner store, for Marks and Spencer's, for a household, is because of this splendid independence between income and expenditure. If tonight you do not go to the pub to drink a pint of beer, you have saved that money. And your income has not been reduced as a result. This splendid independence of your income from your expenditure, which allows you to tighten your belt. But the nation's total expenditure is the nation's total income. So when the government cuts spending by 20% of GDP, GDP is cut by 20%. So your debt to GDP ratio goes from 4/5, 80%, to 100% immediately just because you have practiced austerity. The question is, why is austerity, if it is such a dumb idea and such a dangerous idea, which it is, why is it so popular? The reason has to do with the fact that the liberal bourgeois tradition is wholly and totally in an existentialist crisis, at least for the last 100 years or 200 years, let's say. Let me put it this way. The liberal democratic state is insurance, asset insurance for the rich. And the rich are skimping on the premium. The rich want a powerful state to preserve their property and their assets, but they are worried that a state that has the capacity and the power to preserve their property rights is also a state that can confiscate them. And at the same time, they don't want to pay for it. And the result is debt. And, well, I'm in my last 50 seconds. They are protected. Are they not? So let me wrap it up. Austerity is a bad idea. George Osborne knows that. He was not just discredited because of his silly position and his scaremongering on the Brexit referendum. He was discredited because every time he set a target for a surplus, he missed it. The public sector borrowing requirement increased. Every time it increased, he cut back. The next year, the public sector borrowing requirement increased again. So what do we need to do? It's very simple. We need an investment bank, a public investment bank, at an arm's length from government, which is supported through quantitative easing by the Bank of England, in order to fund directly, on banking principles without political interference, all the shovel-ready projects that are absolutely essential and ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yanis, for that fine speech. And now I turn back to the opposition. Up next we have Mr. Ryan Bourne. Ryan is Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs and a weekly City AM columnist. He is an alumnus of Magdalen College, where he studied economics as an undergrad and an MPhil, and one of the 8 founding members of Economist for Brexit. He is a strong advocate of fiscal consolidation and has written on the debt time bomb facing the UK given an ageing population. Ryan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. It's great to be here. It's quite a peculiar emotion this evening. Listening to Yanis, I wondered whether he was on the wrong side of the debate, given that he'd never had faith in austerity in the first place. But I think it is pretty apt that we have a Greek speaker here tonight, actually, because according to Google, the term austerity actually comes from the Greek word austeros, meaning bitter or harsh taste. And I think the way that the public interprets this term, at least the way that it's used in the political discourse, is not just to do with fiscal consolidation, actually, but is actually about harsh or extreme cuts to government spending. So that's how I'm going to define it for the purposes of my speech. 4 points. First of all, between 2010 and 2015, real government spending in the UK, despite what you hear, fell by just 2.3%. It's planned to essentially remain flat for the rest of this Parliament. In effect, this and the previous government have been keeping real spending essentially the same, trying to allow economic growth to reduce the size of the state as a proportion of GDP. The overall fiscal consolidation, as Vince said, was somewhere between 5 and 6% over the last Parliament. There was actually a very good report by Reform think tank in 2009 which suggested we'd need to consolidate by as much as 8% of GDP. The author of that was one Vince Cable. So government spending cuts have not been harsh or bitter by any stretch. Yet if cuts have been very, very modest, as I've implied that they are, why do we hear so much about austerity? And the reason is because actually within that total spending envelope, the government has increased spending on health, it's increased spending quite significantly on the state pension, it's protected parts of school spending, and debt interest has gone up. And if you protect 2/3 of a budget and you're trying to cut by a small amount, then actually the amount that you have to cut on the remaining third is pretty dramatic. So there has been pretty dramatic cuts to certain departments. So I'm afraid a lot of this debate that you hear is simply a category error. Austerity is not the problem, it's some of the policy choices within a total envelope. So you might have lost faith with the political choices that the governments have been making, but actually, if you believe my figures, and I got them today from the Office for National Statistics and the OBR, there hasn't been much austerity in terms of real government spending cuts overall. Secondly, there's no real evidence actually that spending cuts are holding back our economy in the UK today. In 2011 and 2012, we had slow growth when the coalition increased taxes and cut capital spending. Since then, with cuts to day-to-day government spending and fiscal transfers, the economy actually has grown healthily, if not spectacularly. The employment rate is now at its highest level since records began, and unemployment is low at 4.9%. Where is the evidence that this economy right now is in need of a fiscal stimulus? Yes?
Well, you say that GDP is increasing and so on, but real wages for young people have decreased dramatically, and so that doesn't reflect the growth in the economy.
Well, we had a huge recession, and as a lag of that, real wages do tend to go down. The Keynesian theory actually is one of the reasons why the government is supposed to intervene. It's because nominal wages are sticky, people's cash wages are sticky, and therefore government needs to intervene to try and affect real wages. And real wages have gone down, but unemployment is now low as a result. We're now heading back into the good times. Why do we need a fiscal stimulus now? It doesn't make sense given where the economy is macroeconomically. No, I'm not going to take another one. Now, we certainly have had low productivity, but there's no real theory or evidence that low productivity arises because civil servants' pay has been cut or certain benefits, child benefit, for example, has been taken away. So some people instead say, well, actually, we could get more growth today and more growth in the future if we just spent more on infrastructure spending, to which I've got one word as a response: Japan. Japan tested this to absolute destruction. It spent $6.3 trillion on construction-related public investment. It ran deficits of 6% a year. And whilst it's certainly got some impressive bridges and bullet trains that our politicians love when they go over to visit, economic growth has still been weak, and they have now the highest government debt burden in the world. Meanwhile, here, and it's already been spoken about how the government's not always good at picking projects, do we really believe the government has economic growth in mind when it makes infrastructure spending decisions? Vince's government cut lots of strategic road schemes with benefit-to-cost ratios of 3, 4, some of them even 6, but maintain high-speed 2 with a benefit-to-cost ratio of 1.2. I don't trust the government to invest in projects which will boost economic growth. Third point, there are good reasons on an intergenerational basis to continue to try and cut spending and get debt on a downward path. We've got an ageing population. It's going to put huge upward pressure on pension spending, health spending, social care spending if we leave current policies unchanged. In the past, we've had very high debts. we've inflated them away, we've grown out of them, and we've slashed spending after wars. Well, I'm afraid to tell you we're not in a war right now, after which we're going to cut spending, and almost all of the promises that have been made are actually tied to protect against inflation or economic growth. So what, in effect, Vince and others are saying when they call for more government spending now is they're arguing that the government should borrow more so this generation can finance consumption spending at the expense of our generation, who are not going to be provided with the same entitlements as this generation today. I find that deeply, deeply unethical. Final point, I'll come to Greece, which has instituted real austerity. Now, fiscal consolidation, we know, has a much bigger impact in countries with fixed exchange rates, as Greece effectively is. And I agree with Yanis and his work when he says that tax rises in Greece have been very counterproductive, not least because they undermine the supply potential of the economy. But let's remember how we got here. Greece had to cut spending because it couldn't find anyone to lend it money. As the Greek philosopher Epictetus said, events do not just happen but arrive by appointment. And Greece's main underlying problem is not lack of spending, but its inflexible economy. What Greece needs is economic growth. Austerity is not, reversing austerity is not the silver bullet to achieving that. Greece is the 132nd out of 140 countries for quality of legal frameworks for settling disputes. 115th on the flexibility of wage determination. 128th on the effect of taxes on incentives to work, 136th on the effect of taxation as an incentive to invest. That stuff matters. It matters that Greece is rife with nepotism. It matters that it has wasteful government spending. Why would anyone sane invest in that environment? The idea that more spending is what Greece needs is snake oil and doesn't address the real problem. So I'm just going to wrap up. 4 reasons to defeat this motion tonight. You should defeat this motion because you cannot conceivably call what we've seen in the UK as genuine austerity. You should defeat it because spending more would not boost our economy. You should defeat it because you believe in intergenerational justice. And you should defeat it because both here and abroad, the term is used as a scapegoat to mask political failings to deal with much more significant economic problems and instead focus on this very marginal one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Now, before I turn to our next round of 4-minute floor speeches, I do have a tweet to prove that I'm not just playing around on my phone. I am indeed monitoring feeds, which is from John Casey, who potentially unwisely suggests, what does anyone here really know about austerity, have any suffered from it, and where are the working class voices? Now, I don't know if anyone would like to respond to that, but if not, there we are, John, I have read out your tweet. So, I now turn to some floor speeches. If I could ask, because I did admittedly forget last time, if you could say your name and what college you are either from currently or were from, depending on what generation you're in, that would be fantastic. So, could I have a speech in proposition, please? Yes, there, at the front. If you speak into it, it will come on eventually,
really?
hopefully.
Oh, thank you, yeah. So, I'm Louis, and I'm from an educational charity called DebateMate. And the one thing I'd like to tell you before I start anything is that I'm not an economist, and I'm not going to pretend that I am. The one thing I would like to say is that the example of Japan was raised earlier, and as not an economist, I can kind of guess that we don't have the same economic system as Japan in the first place, really, do we? So that example really, I don't think, kind of stands in this debate. But now, on to what I would really like to talk about. We've had a lot about economics, but I would like to talk about how this affects the people and how I feel like, personally, growing up in a place that isn't very wealthy or well-off, and how that affects me as a person, and as a young person especially. So, when I hear about cuts, I don't care about the GDP. I care about the hole in the ceiling of my school. And that's like really distracting, putting me off my work. And quite frankly, what it tells to me is that, does the government really care about my education? Because we don't have the budget to repair this hole in the ceiling. And it's not just one hole. The school was falling down. And I mean, that's quite ridiculous. I think we can all agree it's ridiculous that my school was falling down and we just did not have the funds to repair it. And that's not the only case. The borough that I live in is having to make £1 million in savings. And what is it going to cut? services like libraries, youth centres, and other things like that I think are very important. And the fact that as a young person, youth centres are getting cut, where are all the youth going to go? People that have come from unstable homes, people that can't have like the good family system that we like to assume everyone does have, where are they going to go now? Constant mischaracterization of people who are from my borough and area as being louts, hoodies, people who got up to no good. But what I'd like to tell you is that isn't just because they've been raised wrong, it's because they've had to suffer as a result of cuts to their public services like libraries and youth centres. And personally, this is what austerity means to me as a young person. And I personally have lost confidence in austerity because it's not really represented how I feel as a young person myself. And you may say, oh, you're 16. You're too young to understand what it means to vote in elections. But I think personally, by standing up here and actually saying how I feel is my political voice, and I think it deserves to be heard a lot more than is being said right now, because all we hear is economics and not actually what we think as people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that floor speech. So I'd now like to ask if we have a floor speech in opposition of the motion at all. Yes, here at the front. Sorry, James, I'm asking you to run back and forth.
Thank you. St John's College a long time ago. Just to reply to the previous floor speaker and to maybe echo some of the points from the opposition, 80 billion is the current debt. That, by any means, is not austerity. That is an 80 billion deficit is not austerity. You can argue about misallocation of resources, so your school roof is leaking. That is not an issue of austerity. It's where the government is spending its money. And it is not spending its money in the right way. So I would urge people to say, we must continue reducing the deficit and hold our politicians of all countries to account to say where should we spend the money rather than burden the future generations, as so eloquently put, in the future, because it is not fair to our children, our grandchildren, to have a huge debt round their neck. And that is why I support the opposition.
Thank you very much indeed. Go on then, yes. I like to see a woman stand up, I'm not going to lie. James?
Sorry, I just wanted to talk about you asked for the voice of the common people, so to speak, in this, and their view on austerity. And I'd like to talk about the fact that austerity is getting worse because of attacks on the banks. Nobody's mentioned banks in this austerity, but the banks have been so instrumental in causing the austerity. And then having caused the austerity, they then caused the kind of cuts like the police cuts, like legal aid cuts, like all the things that would allow you to get justice against a bank if you were attacked by a bank. You don't have those luxuries anymore because of what's happened there. So austerity for the SMEs in this country has been brought on, I think, primarily by the banks. The successive governments haven't been able to control the banks. And of course, when I say SMEs, I mean companies who might employ 10 people or might employ 500 people. And it's got so bad that a government minister told me 3 weeks ago, at an APPG meeting, that it's now affecting GDP. It's got so bad, so something has to be done about it. And it's not really austerity, is it? Because the money has been given to the banks to feed into the SMEs, but it's never got there because the banks have just kept it. So I think we have to be really careful about how we define austerity, which personally I'm sick of because I think it's gone all wrong. But whether or not there are other reasons why this country is not functioning economically, that we can't actually blame on austerity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now have to move back to the main debate, I'm afraid. But up next, we do have on the proposition Lord Karen Bilimoria, who was our Vice President in 1988. Lord Bilimoria is the founder and chairman of Cobra Beer and the UK-India Business Council, as well as a founding member of the Indian Prime Minister's Global Advisory Council. He was appointed as a crossbench life peer in 2006 and is the Chancellor of the University of Birmingham. He's an alumnus of Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge. Karen.
I came up with the idea for Cobra Beer while I was a student at Cambridge. It was not a eureka idea. I did not go running through the streets of Cambridge naked. It evolved as an idea. So austerity has no meaning to me. And when I was going around our breweries in India some years ago, I came across a brewer in Goa, and he said, "Do you know my brother-in-law in Parliament?" I said, "Who is your brother-in-law?" He said, "My brother-in-law is someone called Vince Cable." Now, if he has got a brother-in-law as a brewer, then you've got to believe what he says. Now, as for my other debating partner, Yanis, I mean, firstly, he's an alumnus of Birmingham, so he's got an advantage where I'm Chancellor. He lectured at Cambridge. He's one of us. And unlike Phil, the accountant, our Chancellor, who doesn't have an accountancy qualification, by the way, he rides into office in his motorbike. So, we've got a cool team over here. And he spoke about belt tightening and orgies. I mean, let's get things into perspective. I cannot criticize the president-elect because her mother is here, so you're let off the hook. And as for Ryan, well, he's completely confused, this poor chap. On the one hand, he doesn't trust government to spend. On the other hand, he's into intergenerational, not letting them down and getting completely mixed up. So investing for future generations on the one hand, nope. Burdening future generations is what he talks about. And of course, Vince is very famous for that line when he was leading the Liberal Democrats, when he spoke about Gordon Brown's remarkable transformation in the last few weeks from Stalin to Mr. Bean. And talking about Mr. Bean, John Major said, I strongly believe that man cannot live by GDP alone. Now, that is something. And you see, now you think about austerity. I mean, people, experts, refer to it as the expert. That's the previous debate. I'm not confused, this debate. Experts talk about the austerity con. By insisting on cuts in government spending and higher taxes that could easily have been postponed until the recovery from recession, the government has delayed the recovery by 2 years, and that is Simon Wren-Lewis. The UK austerity, it's the media who wants to portray the reduction of government budget deficit as the overriding macroeconomic priority, when in reality that policy has done and may continue to do considerable harm. So austerity in reality has failed. In fact, the opposition has said austerity hasn't really taken place. So the confusion carries on. And you can argue, could the recovery have been quicker? And somebody who I've always respected is Martin Wolf of the FT. And he said, in the short, the scale of austerity was unnecessary and ill-timed. This is now widely admitted. He talked about increasing public investment. And by the way, you increase public investment not in the way of our former mayor. I'm all for cycling, but London is at gridlock. That is one way of increasing public spending and damaging the economy. But there are ways of doing it for the future generations to benefit from. You can cut taxes. It is not about cutting expenditure and increasing taxes. You actually need to cut taxes to grow. And in terms of believing about monetary policy alone doing the trick, well, how can monetary policy do it when we're already down to zero interest rates virtually? So the right approach is to have a mix of policies. Now, Paul Krugman, another expert, he said, the case for cuts was a lie. Why does Britain still believe it? The austerity delusion. Greece was the disaster, sorry, Jan, that Austerians were looking for. I mean, this may sound too good to be true, and it was. And then there's this link between austerity and growth. The more austere countries have a lower GDP growth rate. So we need to actually start spending for the right reasons to make our economy grow. And George Osborne, of course, he was brought up in business. From his firm, Osborne and Little. No. So even he abandoned the whole concept of balancing the budget by 2020. And Phil, the accountant, He has recently said, the economy has taken a shock, we will do whatever it takes, whatever measures to restore confidence, to stabilize, we will do whatever it needs to restore confidence and to keep Britain as an attractive destination for businesses to invest and create jobs. What talk of austerity there? So let's not talk about the governor of the Bank of England, by the way. He's like distraction in this whole thing. I mean, he talked about increasing interest rates when unemployment went below 7%. Well, unemployment is now down to 5% and interest rates have gone down. So this is not a good way to do it. Well, what about spending? If you want to grow a business, I cannot grow my business by cutting a loan. I have to grow a business by investing to grow. So austerity is actually a concept that is not businesslike. And then if you put things into context, in this wretched referendum, by the way, do you know this £8 billion, the net contribution to the European Union? Who put that into context? Of our 772, I'm almost finished, I'm afraid, of our 772 billion pounds of government expenditure, that makes up 1% of our expenditure. Really, is that going to shift the needle? Not one person brought that in. And in terms of investing in university education, well, the opposition came #1 in the world. Well, you know, we'll let them have it for a while. But Cambridge, Oxford, Imperial College, UCL, our Russell Group universities are the best in the world. And we do that by spending well under half the United States spends as a percentage of GDP on higher education. On research and innovation, we spend well below the OECD average, the EU average, and way below the United States. South Korea spends double as a percentage of GDP than we do. If only we spent more on R&D, if only we spent more on our universities, we would be so much more effective as an economy. Where does austerity come into all this? And wealth creation and entrepreneurship is what creates the jobs, that creates the taxes that pay for the welfare state that makes this wonderful country such a great country where we are the best of the best in every field you can imagine, whether it's advanced engineering, whether it's universities, whether it's beer, whether it's the Olympics and sports, our schools, everything. We are the best of the best. We don't need austerity to do that. We need to invest to do that, and I beg you to vote for this motion.
Thank you very much, Karen, for closing our proposition bench. So I now turn to our final speaker of tonight. It's Baroness Charlotte Vere of Norbiton. Charlotte was the Executive Director of Conservatives In and Finance Director and spokesperson for the No to AV campaign. She challenged the Green Party's Caroline Lucas as the Conservative candidate for Brighton Pavilion in 2010. Charlotte.
Good evening, everybody. This is my 4th Cambridge Union debate, and I'm 2-1, so I want you to make it 3-1 tonight, please. It's a tricky motion to oppose this debate. Austerity. It's a harsh and it's a very brittle term, isn't it? It means different things to different people, doesn't it, Yanis? In different economies, in different countries, in different ways. Some older people, I'm sure there are none of you here this evening, might recall back to wartime austerity, a different solution to a different problem in a different time. But it's also led to a very powerful term, anti-austerity. It's been shouted loudly by the left of the left wing. Austerity means austerity, and it's bad. But of course, austerity is not all the same. What is still termed as austerity in Britain, it's simply not the same as austerity in Greece. Austerity, that harsh, brittle term, as practiced in Britain, is more like a return to sanity, of spending within our means, tightening our belts, as Yanis said. It could be replaced by something, a term that is far more, say, soft and fluffy. Why don't we call it fairness? Modern austerity, as practiced by Britain, is a simple concept of fairness. It is fair on those who pay the taxes, fair on those who use government services, and most of all, it is fair on people of all ages. As a mum, oh, okay, let's not use that one. I am sure that we can all agree, whether we are parents or not, that it is morally wrong to saddle the next generation with our debt. And not just a little bit of debt. We're talking huge swathes of the stuff. The phrase debt burden is one that we're all very familiar with. So despite historically low interest rates, we are currently paying every single year £49 billion of interest. £49 billion. What could we do with that? Well, for the hawks amongst you, and there might be one or two, we could double spending on defence. For the rest of us, more reasonable people, we might say, OK, let's lob another 50% on the education budget. Let's lob another third on the health budget. Or I tell you what, let's not spend it at all. Let's put it in the pockets of the taxpayers. £1,600 for every single taxpayer in this country. But austerities, such as it was needed. The coalition government in 2010 was presented with a post-crisis economy. The country, it needed a government with a bit of a firm hand on the tiller. It was a political necessity to demonstrate that there was a plan, and we've all heard quite a lot about the plan. This was action being taken. Austerity in the UK was born. It sounded tough, it sounded, a little bit manly. It sounded like a plan, and it crept into the lexicon of British politicians. So it was in this coalition government that my esteemed friend Vince Cable served. For the duration, he didn't resign out of principle of not supporting austerity, so it's great to see him on the other side here tonight. Not another Lib Dem flip-flop, I promise. But in the current political climate, of course, things are a little bit different. We're now talking about a country that works for everybody. But I put it to you, it's different rhetoric, but it's exactly the same. It is about fairness. And there's another perhaps unexpected consequence of austerity. It has made all of us sit up and think about tax. Slightly yawny, but it's true. Who pays it? How much do they pay? How much don't they pay? So we have Google, Amazon, Starbucks, and most heartbreaking of all, that stalwart of the British high street, Boots, all subject to intense pressure. Companies have been taking note, and they've been taking action. So, whilst Yanis would like us all to be Athenians now, anti-austerity, Greece is a unique case, and it has few lessons to teach us. I remember being at a lavish wedding in Athens a few years ago. All my very well-heeled people around the table were sharing stories about how little tax they pay. Oh, how proud they were. But, you know, UK is not like Greece, and we can thank God, or perhaps thank the Greek gods for that. But we're not out of the woods yet. The government still spends more than it raises. It is simply unsustainable, and it is an irresponsible state of affairs. We have, as my colleagues have pointed out, we have high levels of employment. We have a strong job-creating economy. And I'm sorry, but Lord Bilimoria, you know, we're quite capable of our economy job-creating without further investment by the state. And we have a robust safety net for the vulnerable. How bloody sunny do the sunlit uplands have to look before we start getting our house in order, to balancing the books? And this is what Keynes said, and I'm surprising myself by quoting Keynes tonight. The boom, not the slump, is the right time for austerity at the Treasury. We should all be Keynesians now. For the alternative is what? More spending? Nay, That's sinful, hey, Yanis. A higher deficit, a mounting debt, it's easy. It's all so easy. Profligate spending is easy. Anyone with a credit card knows that. And yet responsible spending is not. So it's easy for politicians like you, Mr. Varoufakis, to be anti-austerity. Oh, and to blame the rich. Anti a hard and brittle word that has so skillfully been demonized by the left. But it's not so easy, is it, to be anti-sanity, anti-fairness, anti-wanting to make sure that when the next economic shock comes along, we have enough cash under the mattress to get us and the next generation through it. Any alternative is irresponsible. So I say that they are wrong. They seek to cripple our future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, stand up for fairness. Stand up for a return to sanity. And join us in opposing this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for closing tonight's opposition and indeed the debate as a whole. Now, before you all go and you sort of rush off to make your voices heard on either side of the motion, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, Nye Timber, Private Seller and Trinity Alumni, without whom this event quite literally probably wouldn't actually be possible at all, as well as our speakers, of course. Tonight's debate is incredibly important to all of us, most particularly because at the moment the Union is soon about to embark on a capital campaign to raise £7.5 million to help transform the Union's building and our facilities at Bridge Street. Now, the Union's strategy is really driven by two ideas. Firstly, we want to really aim to increase the impact that we have, the reach that we have as a forum for the free exchange of ideas like those that you've heard this evening, while at the same time we want to improve the access that we have in our building to debating, to public speaking, for those who've never traditionally been able to have such experiences. And this campaign is going to be launched later this year in December at the House of Lords. Please do speak to anyone who's been up here on the dais, whether that's myself, whether that's Oliver, who chaired the debate before, Layla in front, or who greeted you at the beginning of tonight's event. If you'd like to discuss this campaign or if you want to get in touch with us at all afterwards. So, thank you very much for coming this evening. This now concludes tonight's debate, and in classic Union style, for this one, we do need you to vote with your feet. And unfortunately, whilst in Cambridge, you might have been able to exit through the main door and abstain. I'm afraid I'm going to ask you to either say aye or no, so you do need to make a decision on this one. So if you'd like to exit through either the door on the left, which is for noes, or ayes on the right, that would be fantastic. And if we could start filtering out from the closest side to the doors, that would be even better. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you all later.